Good afternoon and welcome to our podcast where we are covering the Salem witch trials and excess Satanism. The purpose of this podcast is to get a basic grasp of knowledge from the trials and where they originated. Where did they originate? The trials took place in a town called Salem. Salem is located in the state of Massachusetts. This all started when a local doctor failed to perform successful treatment on two daughters. In the events of this, the doctor then proceeded to blame his failures on witchcraft. Not many had thought much of this minor inconvenience at first. However, when more strange obstacles kept occurring around town, the townspeople then grew more and more suspicious of why this was happening to them. Eventually, these people came to a conclusion that this was an inside job. The people claimed that ergot poisoning was the leading cause of the spell that was put on the town. The men of the town conducted a search door to door, house to house, to try and find as many suspicious people as possible. They were trying to rid their town of such witchcraft. When they found their supposed culprits, the men rounded them all up and took them to the courthouse to be put on trial. The people they found were mostly women and sometimes even children. The trials had lasted days, weeks, and some even longer. Back in the days of 1692, the people showed no mercy, meaning that not only women would get executed if thought guilty, but young children as well. The town believed that the executions would make the curses go away. In the first book published about the trials, The Wonders of the Invisible World by Cotton Mather, they go into depth with many details of the trials. As you would expect, the book shows first-hand sources and conversations of what happened. However, there was a disclaimer in the book saying that it was authorized by the government. This means that the government had some sort of say in what the author could and could not publish for the rest of the world to see. There is a chance that the government blocked the people from seeing the truth of what really happened throughout the trials. Did the government cover up facts from the original book? That is the question we all want to know. Will we ever receive a truthful answer to this question? I don't believe so, unfortunately. My research question revolves around conspiracy, and almost no amount of digging will get me the answer I desire. I think the government did cover up a few significant parts revolving around the trials and what went on during them. They most likely did this to protect the reputation of the town of Massachusetts. There are many sources, books, diaries, and court records involved in these trials. Many people who examined the trials also explained that they felt like something was missing or being hidden from them as well. There were a few secondary sources I had discovered while researching the Salem witch trials. One of the sources is labeled Death in Salem, The Private Lives Behind the 1692 Witch Hunt by Diane Folds. Death in Salem is the first book to go into depth for this time period. Folds replicates the feelings of involvement for the reader by examining the lives of the witch trial participants from a personal perspective. That being said, the evidence is backed by the author and information inside of the book as well. Massachusetts settlers had very difficult lives. Every person who played along in the Salem drama took on hardships barely even thinkable today. My source for Death in Salem is backed by the author herself, Diane Folds. Folds is a direct descendant from a member involved in the trials. Therefore, she is included in more information, which is valuable to many. Every person who played along in the Salem drama took on hardships barely even thinkable, as I have said before. Salem witchcraft will always have a magnetic pull on the American psyche. During the 1692 witch trials, more than 150 were arrested. An estimated 25 million Americans, including author Diane Folds, are descended from the 25 individuals executed. Folds wanted to know and understand the truth of what happened to her ancestors in greater depth. This secondary source has everything to do in relation to the Salem witch trials because of how connected the author and many others are to the people involved in the trials. Also, this source takes an enhanced eye on the story itself. The main reason Folds decided to write the non-fiction novel was so that she could let the readers of the trials know and understand how crazy it became. Another purpose she could be making this book is because she may be looking into her family history. The author used a large sum of research to find information on every individual. Each person in the book had a connection in some way of marriage and people living in their household. Critics say heavy on facts, light on narrative flair. This secondary source of mine relates to my topic because of how the book is needed to obtain real and factual information about the events that happened here. The source of information I am looking at dives deeper into the lives of others who were personally involved. Having this information at hand is extremely significant because without it, I would be shorthanded with certain information and details being left out. I evaluated this source by seeing facts that most authors would not have. Also, this source contains a descendant of the people accused of witchcraft. The author contains valuable information, as I have said before. One scholarly source on the Salem witch trials is the book A Storm of Witchcraft, The Salem Trials and American Experience by Emerson W. Baker. Baker provides a detailed account of the social, political, and religious context that led to the witch trials and analyzes the roles of gender, class, and power in shaping the accusations and prosecutions. He argues that the trials were not simply a product of mass hysteria or irrational fears, but were instead driven by complex social and cultural dynamics. This book offers a nuanced and insightful perspective on one of the most infamous events in American history. What led me to select this source is for the quality of the work and the detail that Folds put into her book. How this compares with other works that I have seen compared to Folds' work is by how many quotes and first-hand sources she has. Folds' book seems much more realistic to me and even believable at this point. There are many sources to choose from, but the work of Folds has stuck out to me because of the dedication and the process in which she took to pull direct interviews and personal thoughts from the people involved. To wrap things up, Folds goes into much depth on the trials that took place back in 1692. The work of Folds shows many thoughts and feelings of the people involved from the trials. The book she writes from many different perspectives. She goes all the way from accusers and victims to judges and clergy. Every story builds up to the trials one way or another. The number one reason Folds decided to write this article was to touch the readers and display how crazy times were. The author relates to my topic because of how many facts and real events are invested into this rare book. According to the historyofmassachusetts.org, there is a 10-page narrative published in 1692 about the Salem witch trials about Deodat Lawson's personal observations of the events at Salem in the spring of 1692. Lawson had a personal interest in Salem because he had been the minister at Salem Village from 1867 to 1868, but denied the position of full minister after several parishioners objected to his permanent tenure as a result of ongoing disputes between them. The narrative had been written by the time Lawson had been invited to Salem to serve as a guest preacher for the Sabbath service on March 20th, 1692. His sermon was interrupted several times by some of the afflicted girls in attendance. According to ejournals.bc.edu, there had been 3 different books written about the trials. Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum wrote Salem Possessed, Carol F. Carlson's The Devil in the Shape of a Woman, and David D. Hall's Worlds of Wonder, Days of Judgment. These books all reflected the difficult time periods in the trials, and each gave a different perspective on what was going on at the time. Boyer and Nissenbaum focus on the rise of capitalism and the accompanying social tensions. Carlson focuses on the role of misogyny, and Hall is more focused on the role of popular folklore and fears of social tension. As I've previously stated, these 3 sources focus on the different roles of the trials and give great knowledge on this topic. In sum, the Salem witch trials were a series of hearings and prosecutions of people accused of witchcraft in colonial Massachusetts between February 1692 and May 1693. The trials resulted in the execution of 20 people, 14 of whom were women, and the imprisonment of over 150 others. The causes of the Salem witch trials are complex and multifaceted. One contributing factor was the religious climate of the time, which emphasized a belief in the existence of witches and the devil. Puritan ministers and leaders preached that Satan was actively working to corrupt their community, and the witches that were among his most dangerous agents. Another factor was the political and social tensions within the community. The Puritan settlers of Massachusetts were deeply divided over issues of land ownership, trade, and governance. Accusations of witchcraft became a means for settling personal scores and gaining power within the community. The first accusations of witchcraft in Salem were made in January 1692 by a group of young girls, as I've stated before. These girls claimed to have been bewitched by three women: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Tituba, a slave from Barbados, was the first to be accused when she was forced to confess to practicing witchcraft under duress. Her confession, along with the accusations of the girls, set off a chain reaction of accusations and arrests. The trials were conducted in a highly flawed and biased manner. The accused were denied legal counsel and often subjected to physical torture in order to extract confessions. The testimony of so-called spectral evidence, in which the accusers claimed to see the spirits of the accused tormenting them, was given equal weight to physical evidence. Many of the accused were women who were seen as threats to patriarchal order of the community. They were often poor, unmarried, or widowed, and accused of consorting with the devil in order to gain power and influence. The trials continued to escalate until May 1693, when the governor of Massachusetts, William Phips, disbanded the court and released all those who were still imprisoned. The trials left a lasting impact on the community, leading to a deep sense of guilt and shame over the wrongful execution of innocent people. In recent years, scholars have re-examined the Salem witch trials and sought to understand the social and cultural factors that led to this dark chapter in American history. Some have argued that the trials were a form of mass hysteria, while others have emphasized the role of political and economic tensions in fueling the accusations. Ultimately, the Salem witch trials serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism, political oppression, and the abuse of power. They remind us of the importance of upholding the principles of due process and justice, and of the need to guard against the kind of irrational fear and hysteria that can lead to such tragic outcomes.
Many view the events of the Salem witch trials to be a special case in history, when mass false condemning has happened throughout time. Parallels to the Salem witch trials can be seen during the Red Scare, mass lynching in the South, and the lesser-known Satanic Panic during the 1980s. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, mass lynching against African Americans and immigrants in the U.S. for false crimes was a major issue. It is estimated that over 5,000 were murdered by vigilantes via lynching. While the Red Scare did not involve mass killings in the 1950s, individuals were accused of being communists trying to overthrow the government during the Red Scare. Many lives were ruined in the process of America's masses hunting down supposed invaders. Many people know something about these events, but nothing about fears of Satanism in the 1980s. The 80s marked parents fearing that their children could be corrupted and that there were hidden groups of cults abusing preschoolers. In this section, you'll learn more about the history of satanic fears that were widespread following the release of a psychiatrist's book and the effects felt even today. The Satanic Panic is marked by over a decade worth of accusations of individuals practicing Satanism through activities such as blood rituals, sacrifices, child abuse, and other occult rituals by overzealous citizens. The beginning of the moral panic is believed to take place in Canada, with the release of the 1980 book Michelle Remembers by Lawrence Pastor and Michelle Smith. The book involved Canadian psychiatrist Dr. Pastor helping Michelle unveil repressed memories of her childhood, which involved being initiated into the occult. The book planted the seeding idea that there were underground, organized groups of Satanists and influenced many other writers to release their own books about Satanism. Rumors snowballed over time as more people began believing in the idea of Satanists hiding in plain sight. There is no evidence to support the story, than Michelle remembers. However, both authors stated at the time that the events in the book were real. Michelle and Dr. Pazder would be interviewed numerous times, spreading the idea of Satanism. However, many were still skeptical of the author's claims. There were no references to police investigations in the book, and Pazder fails to mention if the police ever verified the existence of these cults. Michelle remembers would be the catalyst of panic over satanic crimes. However, it wasn't until court cases emerged that mass accusations became common. Years later, Dr. Pazder would admit that the book was fiction, and the book would be discredited. Like the Salem witch trials, a lot of people were spreading misinformation for monetary gain. Dr. Pazder would use the book to propel his career forward and deepen his pockets. Pazder credited himself as an expert on ritual abuse and was used as a consultant for many court cases on a suspected cult activity. Pazder would also go on to marry Michelle. Michelle Remembers was the origin of hysteria over satanic crimes, but a court case in Manhattan Beach, California sparked widespread coverage in the media over satanic cults. The McMartin preschool was like any other. It was owned by the McMartin family, which consisted of 4 family members, and the school had 3 teachers. The ordeal initially began when a 39-year-old mother had accused one of the male teachers at the preschool of molesting her son. The case was dismissed, but the police sent letters to over 200 families in the area. The letters directed parents to talk to their children about sodomy and abuse. Parents immediately began questioning their adolescents and talking to their neighbors. Often, parents and therapists questioning the children would ask leading questions, coercing the kids into reporting sexual abuse. The therapist would interview the child and repeatedly ask the same questions until they got the response that they were looking for. Keep in mind that the majority of the children being questioned are under the age of 5. Additionally, child sexual abuse was a crime that was relatively new for the time and unknown to many experts. In 1984, the 3 teachers and 4 members of the McMartin family were accused of sexually molesting hundreds of their students and engaging in ritual abuse. There were also deranged accusations that in addition, the children had seen witches flying, traveled in hot air balloons, and were taken through underground tunnels. The case was taken to court, where it would eventually become one of the longest and most expensive court cases in American history. Amusingly, when shown multiple photographs, one of the children identified Chuck Norris as being one of the offenders. There was no physical evidence to support the accusations, and eventually the defendants were acquitted. But there were impacts beyond Manhattan Beach. Large media coverage over the McMartin case caused a snowball effect across America, and numerous daycares were accused of child abuse and Satanism. The next decade saw a wave of accusations and investigations related to similar crimes to those found in the McMartin case. The panic over satanic crimes quickly spread throughout the entirety of the United States and even to other countries. One of the biggest reasons that this fear spread was because many people would go out and network with others. It was very common for churches, psychologists, and sometimes even police to hold community meetings over satanic groups. Individuals would coin themselves as being experts in the study of ritual abuse cases, similar to Dr. Pazder, and would inject their biased opinions onto the matter. News networks often featured cases related to occult crimes, exaggerating the evidence against the accused. There were many who were skeptical of the accusations made over Satanism. However, the majority of the population believed this to be a real problem based on the number of incidents it had been cited in. Now that many people thought there to be underground satanic cults in America, the population began to fear that children might be part of these groups. While children were viewed as being able to identify witches during the Salem witch trials, children during the 1980s were now believed to be the ones partaking in witchery. The satanic panic saw groups targeting new culture behaviors and labeling them as being indicators of Satanism. Parents began trying to protect their children in pointing out events that are connected to teenage behaviors they determined to be inappropriate. Teenagers were not depicted as actively trying to join the cult, but instead being misled into seeking power. The public believed that there were complicated underground cult schemes in place to turn children away from God. People did not believe that children would actively engage in certain behaviors out of free will, and that there were some outside forces influencing their teenagers. Children who listened to heavy metal, played Dungeons and Dragons, dressed in black clothing, or acted rebellious were automatically suspected of participating in the occult. The belief that heavy metal music was influencing children to join underground groups caused the war on metal music. The public believed that heavy metal bands such as Dio and Judas Priest had subliminal messages hidden in the song that would only play when it was reversed.
Outside intelligent forces with supernatural power are occasionally able to play an artist much like we would play a musical instrument.
In 1990, a 19-year-old named James Vance attempted to commit suicide. He survived the incident and then claimed that his actions were influenced by Judas Priest. Judas Priest was taken to court over said believed hidden messages, encouraging children to commit suicide. In response, the band members said that if they were to use subliminal messages, it would be to tell children to buy more records. The case was dismissed due to a lack of evidence, but the band paid $250,000 in legal costs.
They show these same programs, the rock concerts, on television, and it's just like all hell was let loose. In fact, you may not like what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it anyway because I'm not afraid to speak out. I think that the music in hell for eternity be some of this rock music with all its vulgarities and all of its sexual innuendos.
The populace wanted to censor certain songs and albums that had lyrics they described as immoral. Instead of listening to the songs or reading the lyrics prior to buying them, parents believed the problem to be the bands themselves. Led by the Parents Music Resource Center, or PMRC for short, which was led by 4 politicians' wives, Americans set out to censor content they seemed explicit. The PMRC used a label system to rate songs that was very similar to the movie industry. There were 4 labels: sexually explicit, violence, drug and alcohol references, or occult content. The PMRC demanded that the recording industry implement this rating system and that explicit records be stored behind counters. The efforts of this group eventually led to the Parental Advisory Sticker, which is placed on records that were inappropriate for children. Some say that the Parental Advisory Sticker made more teenagers buy the records, stating that they were easier to find now. While heavy metal was especially targeted by overzealous citizens, there were other New Age thoughts that were labeled satanic. Interestingly, certain clothing immediately made teenagers suspected of practicing the occult. Black clothing and metal t-shirts are described as being telltale signs of Satanism. Some schools even banned students from wearing peace symbols because they depicted the cross of Nero, which was used by Romans and Nazis to mock Christians. Role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons were also accused by multiple Christian organizations of leading children to Satanism. The fantasy board game was believed to alter the behaviors of teenagers, and that many took the game too far. One specific case included a student at the University of Michigan. The student, Dallas Egbert, had disappeared for over a month and was suspected of hiding in the underground steam tunnels on the campus. A private detective suspected that Egbert was playing Dungeons and Dragons in the underground tunnels. However, the student was never found. The news quickly published articles of Egbert's disappearance and its relationship to the game. Dungeons and Dragons quickly saw an exponential growth in sales after Egbert's disappearance, and religious groups started to actively protest against the game. The problem now was that Dungeons and Dragons was becoming so popular that killings and suicides were being linked with the game. A similar situation is happening today with mass shootings. There have been many mass shootings occurring in multiple states throughout the United States for these past couple of years. A few of the many mass shootings have been done by transgenders, and many link the two as being directly correlated, when in actuality, the majority of shootings are completed by cisgendered males.
The Satanic Panic of the 1980s was a period of mass hysteria in the general public over fears of the occult. While the panic began with the book Michelle Remembers, the idea of hitting cultists became widespread with media coverage and hollow court cases. The widespread fears over underground Satanists caused a string of accusations that resulted in many innocent people being convicted or harmed. The panic was used by many to increase ratings, sales, and general monetary gain at the expense of children, the public, and certain groups of people. Instead of paying attention to the facts and evidence, people chose to throw it all out the window for temporary sensation and to protect their beliefs from conjured enemies. People pointed out certain teenage behaviors as being satanic, listening to metal, playing fantasy games like Dungeons and Dragons, or even wearing specific clothing made children suspected victims despite the lack of evidence. Throughout time, the same phenomenon has been seen, where new culture causes citizens to panic. It is our responsibility morally to look at the facts and accept that changes are a part of life that should not be rejected. Thanks for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you've learned something new.